When there's nothing left but the fire in my chest and the air that fills my lungs, I'll hold my tears and
Welcome to Iron Rhetoric with your intrepid host, Pastor Brett McAtee. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own.
They didn't use the phrase Christian nationalism, but you can be sure that's what they were going after, as well as the idea of ethno-nationalism or the racial realism or the idea of kinism. All of that was loudly denounced in the Associate Reformed Church, the ARP, the RPCNA, which stands for Reformed Presbyterian Church North America, and the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America. All of these three denominations all accepted a statement put out by a low IQ minister, and they all adopted it as their statement, even though people were screaming and putting up podcasts when this is all going on, saying you can't do this. This is insane, but they did it. So anyway, going back to Wolfe again. Clergy still think that wanting a Christian nation means theonomy or theocracy or postmillennialism or transformationalism. And of course, those are scary things to conservative denominations, because the last few decades has found them warring against the idea of, especially the idea of theonomy, and the accoutrements that rise up out of theonomy. So they remain scared to death of theonomy, of Rushdoony, of Greg Bahnsen, and others. Wolfe goes on to say, they, referring again to the clergy, still think that two-kingdom theology requires secularism. And again, Wolfe is himself a two-kingdom guy, but now when he talks about the clergy thinking that two-kingdom theology requires secularism, that is pointed towards radical two-kingdom theology, the kind that R. Scott Clark and Michael Horton and David Van Drunen and G.G. Hart, J.V. Fesco, the kind that they follow. Oh, I have to pause here. This is a little tangent. When it comes to this idea of requires secularism, I had a chap tell me that he was in a conversation some time ago with Dr. J.V. Fesco, and Fesco said, "I'm not an expert on who should be using what bathroom. I'll leave that to the experts. My job is to preach the gospel." That's the kind of lunacy that you get with radical two kingdom theology. You get clergy saying, and not just clergy, but those reputed to be something in the church. You get them saying that he's not, it's not really his concern about who uses what bathroom. That, my friends, is insane. That is gaslighting at its very best. All right. Anyway, that was a rant. That was a tangent. Take it for what it's worth. Wolfe says the Reformed clergy still think that two kingdom theology requires secularism. Reformed clergy are stuck, Wolfe goes on to say, in the debates of the last few decades. Many think they're combating something akin to federal vision, a menace threatening sound doctrine. That is false, of course. What they're combating, Wolfe says, is classical Protestantism. They're in a rut, referring to the modern clergy. And again, I just don't think the IQ level is very high in the modern clergy. Otherwise, Wolfe wouldn't be having the problem he's having, and I wouldn't be having the problem that I'm having. Michael Spangler wouldn't be having the problem that he's having. Michael Hunter wouldn't be having the problem that he's having. Ryan, is it Underhill? Can't remember his last name for sure now, in the Episcopal Church wouldn't be having the problems he's having. But anyway, so how do I respond to this? Well, first of all, we know that Wolfe habitually focuses negatively on theonomy, postmillennialism, and transformationalism. And that is because of, as I've said, his worldview, like the radical two-kingdom worldview, abominates theonomy, postmillennialism, and transformationalism. If Wolfe had his way, theonomy, postmillennialism, and transformationalism would be extinguished. And here we begin to get at the nub of the matter. Wolfe does not. Wolfe desires Christian nationalism, but as I said, he desires it as existing in a Thomistic natural law context, which is at severe variance with theonomy, postmillennialism, and transformationalism. So Wolfe has the problem going on right now is he's in combat on people that agree with him that theonomy, postmillennialism, and transformationalism sucks, but yet who do not agree with him that Christianity should be influential in the realm of common grace, or where we do 90% of our living. So he's in a tight spot. On one hand, he has to battle against those who share his Thomistic natural law beginning points, that is radical two-kingdom theology, but who come to an 180-degree different conclusions than what Wolfe arrives at. Well, at the same time, Wolfe has to battle against those who share his desire for Christian nationalism, but who have zero interest in accepting the premises upon which the Christian nationalism is pinned. Wolfe is in the same position that the Germans were in both World War I and, well, especially in World War I. He's having to fight a two-front warfare. In World War I, the Germans had to fight on the West and on the East against the Russian, on the West against the Allies. And, of course, if you're in a war, you never want to fight a two-front war, but that's what Wolfe's having to fight right now. And I can understand the man's frustrations. Personally, I hope he has to keep on fighting the two-front war because it's good for my cause, which is a theonomic, worldviewish type of understanding of Christian nationalism. Secondly, we would also say that Wolfe misses a point here that is cheek by jowl with an observation I've already made, given that Wolfe says immediately above what I quoted earlier, it seems to be the case that Stephen Wolfe believes that it's possible to avoid theocracy. Now, remember, he said in that quote above that they think, that is, the clergy of the Reformed denominations thinks he, that is Stephen Wolfe, is advocating theocracy, and he is saying, no, I'm not advocating theocracy. However, given that established churches are an inescapable category, as I argued earlier, so it's the case that theocracy is likewise an inescapable category. All political arrangements, without exception, are theocratic. It cannot be escaped. So it's never a case of if theocracy. Instead, it's always the case of which God shall rule. Who's going to be the theo in the cracy? All governments create law. The creation of law is an expression of morality. And morality, whether that morality is right or wrong, is without fail an expression of some religion, which is itself descending from some God or God concept. And so all governments are theocracies. And how do I know? I just told you how I know. Because they have to make law, and law is based on morality, and morality is based on religion, and religion is based on theology. So all governments are theocratic without exception. Currently, right now, you cannot name one country, and you can never name one country in all of history that wasn't theocratic. Now, I freely admit that some governments, especially in the classical liberal political order that we have now, they seek to hide the fact that they're hopelessly theocratic, but that doesn't change the fact that they are. And I gave an example of that earlier. For example, in our system, it's said that all gods are allowed into the public square. But that's not exactly true, is it? Because the theocratic nature of our government says all gods are allowed in the public square except the God who says that no other gods are allowed into the public square. And of course, which God says that? The God who says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Right? So we are a theocratic nation. I've given you a couple examples now. And our theocracy does not allow the God of the Bible to be the sole God in the public square. And so, contra Wolfe, who says he wants to avoid theocracy, I say that theocracy is, by definition, unavoidable. And by the way, it's not a matter of Brett says it. I've tried to demonstrate how it's logically necessary. The phrase is, it's an inescapable category. There are lots of those, by the way. God's reality is God's reality. You can't make it go away. You can change it up, you can dress it up in funny-looking clothes, but it's still God's reality. Anyway, when we talk about Wolfe, Wolfe complains about many clergy thinking that all two-kingdom theology requires secularism, and he's at this point tilting at the windmills that's now routinely known as R2K. And I'm not going to spend more time there because I've already gone into that. Fourthly, we would say we begin to see why those who are the legitimate inheritors of the tradition of Rushdoony, Bonson, Clark, C. Greg Singer, Francis Nigel Lee, Francis Schaeffer, etc., as opposed to the libertarian theonomy of Gary North, Doug Wilson, Andrew Sandlin, Joel Booth, etc., we can see why they're frustrated with Stephen Wolfe. Again, it is the true inheritors of Rushdoony that are the most frustrated with Wolfe. Some of these other guys, who I'm calling libertarian theonomists, they have some problems with Wolfe, but not as much as the full-blown 2K guys do. What clergy are choking on are the idea of paying the price of accepting Wolfe's Thomistic natural law worldview in order to have Christian nationalism. That's what true theonomists like myself choke on, and even the R2K guys are choking on that. It needs to be understood that if Wolfe's vision of Christian nationalism were to come to pass, it would only come to pass at the cost of giving up on presuppositionalism across the board. And I've noted that earlier, and so I won't go into that again now. So it's becoming clear that there are more flavors of Christian nationalism, as I said, than there are flavors of Baskin-Robbins ice cream. This really is part of the problem having a civil conversation on the subject of Christian nationalism, because when you use that phrase, people's minds go everywhere. Some people's minds go to the worst example. They go to Hitler. Although, again, all the crap that's been piled on Hitler, some of that needs to be reconsidered. I'm not talking about rehabilitating him. I'm just talking about understanding why he's been attacked the way he's been attacked. But you could also include Mussolini. As I said earlier, you could include Franco. What was that guy in, was it Argentina? Was it Chile? I can't remember his name. Allende. I'm probably getting outside of
the recent leader, is that right?
Well, it's been a while. So anyway, there are a lot of different variants of Christian nationalism, and it's why it's hard to have a conversation, because you probably need to kick off the conversation with precisely defining what you're getting at. But in fairness to Wolfe, Wolfe wrote a 500-page book on Christian nationalism. So if they're going after Wolfe, it's not as if he hasn't defined his terms. And he's defined his terms so that he's made it clear that he's not the things that they're accusing him of. Isn't it funny? I find myself here defending Wolfe. So we have to ask ourselves, the Christian nationalism, when we begin talking about it, is the Christian nationalism of Oliver Cromwell? Is it the Christian nationalism of the antebellum South? Is it the Christian nationalism of Althusius or of Bullinger, of Lincoln, of Burke, of the Reconstructionists? There's so many Christian nationalisms and so little time. This is part of the problem with the statement that Napark put out. They just threw the crap against the wall without really defining what their terms was. So they put out this statement, and then they put together, at least one of them said, we need to have a study committee on what Christian nationalism is. Now, wait a minute. You just condemned Christian nationalism, and now you're saying you need to have a committee to study what it is to help the churches? I mean, you talk about getting the cart before the horse. I mean, again, that's an IQ thing. It's just stupid.
The SBCs just did the same thing in recent years regarding women pastors. Oh, you know what the Baptist Faith and Message is? We know what Scripture says, but we're going to have a committee that study this subject deeper.
Right. So we go on to cite Wolfe here, and this Iron Ink podcast looks to be a little bit longer than I thought it would be. But anyway, it's worth the time. Wolfe writes in that X tweet, he says, quote, they, referring again to the clergy, the Reformed clergy, the supposed white hat clergy, the conservative Reformed clergy. It's just all of it makes me laugh because they're not conservative, they're not white hats, and they're not on this subject particularly Reformed. But he says they are modern evangelicals on the church-state questions. They are not Reformed. He says, I have found that most pastors, theologians, and academics in NAPARC don't care about the mountains of evidence in the tradition against them. But the laymen do care, and they're reading the old books, the venerable dead. More and more laymen will understand classical Protestant political thought better than their pastors and teachers. And in the end, denominational leaders being obstinate in the face of evidence will try to wield denominational authority against these laymen, these informed laymen, and that is the future our leaders have chosen, but it's not too late to choose humility. I understand, Wolfe. I wish you wouldn't have put the last line on there because nobody wants to be told that they have to choose humility. I mean, that just comes to say you need to choose the path of humility comes across as what?
Arrogant.
Arrogant. That's right. So I wish you wouldn't have put that tagline in, but I understand the frustrations. I really do. I mean, as somebody who is through the ceiling with frustration, I understand why he would say it's not too late to choose humility.
But one distinction that you make that a lot of his critics don't, you understand he's making his arguments from a non-clergy perspective.
Right.
Because he's not clergy.
Right.
A lot of his other detractors, like, no, he should do what a pastor does and do X, Y, Z. Well, he's not one, so why should he?
Right. And I don't fault him for not being clergy. I don't say that he has to be clergy and have an opinion. That's not why I think he's wrong. I think he's wrong because I think he's wrong.
Yeah, 100%, yeah.
And so I would only say that it's one thing to say you're not clergy. It's another thing to say you're not a theologian. And I know what he means by that. He says that in his book. But really, that's a bit of a game, too, because he may not be a theologian by training, but everything that any of us do, especially in terms of what we write, is an expression of our what?
Our theology.
Our theology. So he is a theologian, although I think I understand when he says I'm not a theologian, he's saying I'm not classically trained to be a theologian. But I still think it's confusing, and I don't know. I think what he's doing at that point, let me just spend a second teasing that out. I think what he's saying at that point is, okay, you have theologian in one box over here, and you have political theorists in this box over here, and you have cultural anthropologists in this box over here, and you have economists in this box over here, and never do these boxes meet. And if that's what he's saying, and I think it is, I would have incredible umbrage with that kind of an idea, because my understanding is that you don't have these different containers that are unrelated to one another. Theology remains the queen of the sciences. It is the underwater artesian well out of which a lot of fountains like economics, like political theory, like cultural anthropology, they're all fountains that come up from this same artesian well. It is the artesian well of theology. So when Wolfe says I'm not a theologian, I think there's more in that statement than just I'm not a classically trained theologian. But allow me to respond briefly to Wolfe's statement. Here, Wolfe plays the game that I suppose all of us as contestants in this battle royale play, and it is a battle royale. In that snippet I just quoted by Wolfe desires to be the arbiter of what constitutes being reformed. And I don't fault him for that. I mean, I want to be the arbiter of what constitutes reformed. I think everybody does, right? So I don't fault him for that. If one does not agree with Stephen Wolfe, one is running a couple quarts low per Wolfe of his reformed oil in his engine. Though I must say I agree with Wolfe that most reformed pastors are not particularly reformed on this subject. I said that earlier. And honesty requires me to admit that I don't find Stephen Wolfe to be particularly reformed here either. I mean, yes, he's in the Reformed tradition, but that doesn't mean the Reformed tradition was right. I mean, part of the idea of the Reformation is that we are reformed and continue to be reforming, right? There's more light to spring forth from Scripture. So it's okay to say, yes, we have this in our tradition, but guess what? The tradition was wrong, and here's why, and here's where we can correct it. Secondly, we would say there certainly is a mountain of evidence that supports Dr. Wolfe. Just as there's a mountain of evidence from Reformed theology that supports how the theonomist arrives at his political theology. So here Dr. Wolfe admits that he is a neophyte, having confessed many times that he's not a theologian. And yet he's doing this kind of I would say, theological work. I noted that just a few minutes ago. Finally, on this point, Stephen appeals to the rise of the layman. I want to talk about that a second. Wolfe seems to think that the laymen are going to rise up out of the ashes and are going to throw off the clergy. Well, I just want to say history isn't on his side on that issue. History at various times there have been more than a few who counted on the layman to overthrow the expert class. And that's what the clergy are, of course, right? They're the so-called expert class. That's what makes it so unbearable when they get it wrong. Yes, it's happened a few times where the layman came around to rescue the day, so to speak. More often, though, it's the expert class that divides within itself, with eventually one set throwing the other set overthrowing them. And then the laymen follow. For example, you can look at the Reformation. The Reformation wasn't a case of the layman rose up. It was a case of Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and Bullinger and countless others rising up within the Roman Catholic Church and then saying to the Roman Catholic Church, you're wrong. And then the layman rose up to support this division in the expert class. So speaking only for myself as counsel to Dr. Wolfe, I wouldn't bet the house on a tidal wave of laymen becoming familiar with the original sources so as to overthrow the putative expert class. There will be a few laymen, but on the whole, laymen have to work for a living. They have to raise a family. And that doesn't allow, for the lion's share of them, the time required to invest in the reading and the studying. Look, I spent the first 10 years in the ministry as a tent maker, which for those of you not in the know, tent maker means that you were working outside the home as well as serving as clergy and minister of a church. And that 10 years in my memory is always going to be marked by trying to fit a gallon in a quart jar. There was all kinds of studying and reading I needed to do. I was reading. Don't tell anybody this, but I was reading while I was I had an hour, 45-minute drive to work, and then later an hour drive to work. And I was reading while I was driving. I mean, I know that sounds insane, but I needed to get the reading in. Yeah, and it was insane. Okay, I was insane on that. I would never do it again. If you're listening, don't do that. But that's what I was doing. All that's to say is that you can't expect the layman to rise up like he suggests and be the ones that end up bringing Reformation. Could it happen? Yeah, with God all things are possible. It's not. It's unlikely. I do agree with Wolfe that the denominations will try to a power play to get their way. They're already doing that. I mean, look at the way they treated Spangler. Look at the way they treated Michael Hunter. It's abominable. Even Zach Garris, who's still in the PCA, has people snipping at his heel over the mildest of observations about Southern Presbyterian history. The conservative Reformed denominations on this subject have become woke. Now, you might say they've become woke light, but guess what? Woke light is still woke, right? And so they've brought in a critical theory. They've remarketed it, repackaged it, dressed it up in pietistic clothing, but that's what they're operating out of on this particular subject. And so they are trying power plays, and I suspect that's going to continue. I mean, my name has been run through the mud more than probably anybody's out there. And what that is, that's power play. I still am befuddled at all the attention that I've gotten nationally for saying things that 2 500-page books are out now on anthologies on quotes from the church fathers that support what I'm saying, that I don't say anything different than. Yeah, if you're frustrated, if you can tell I'm frustrated, I am. I'll go a step further than Dr. Wolfe. I see a day coming when the splits that have begun in the so-called conservative Reformed denominations will accelerate to the point that more and more denominations will split off and be created. I think the name Occidental Reformed Church, for example, for a denomination would be grand. And we're already seeing this begin to play out, this phenomena of churches splitting. And I think it's going to continue. For example, the Reformed Church of America recently had a split off of people who were supposedly more conservative. Now, I consider those more conservative people to be liberal, but the denomination as a whole was too liberal for them, so they split off and created something that's not quite a denomination, but is still a collection of churches. Recently, more than a few CRC churches, Christian Reformed churches, have departed that denomination over disagreements on these kinds of issues. For the CRC, it was the whole sexual transgender sodomite issue. There's a new presbytery that was started several years ago called the Vanguard Presbytery, and that departed largely, I think, out of the PCA. In Indiana, and there may be congregations outside of Indiana, but that's where the Baileys live. Tim and what is Tim's brother's name? I've lost it. Anyway, a few years ago, they created a phone booth denomination, also largely out of the PCA, and I expect this kind of thing to continue. So I don't think the laymen are going to rise up and take over these current denominations. I just don't see that in history happening. I think what's going to happen is you're going to have these continued splits, maybe little shards, maybe bigger splits. Time will tell. And we're at the point, as the poet said, where turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, and the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now, yeah, that's a bit overboard. There's going to be no blood that's going to be loosed upon the world and the denominations. But what I'm getting at here is that there is a fracturing that's already present, and I believe is going to already develop, because the people like McAtee and Spangler, like Michael Hunter, we're not going away, and our numbers are only going to increase. And this issue has become what justification was to the 16th century. That's where we're at. So we spent a little bit of time looking at Dr. Wolfe's template, and I think by this exchange that we've been through, you can begin to see the difference between Wolfe's vision of Christian nationalism and my vision of Christian nationalism, though I haven't teased that out completely. In brief, my vision would be an anti-federalist Christian nationalism and Catholicism. It was known as distributism. It's just the idea that each jurisdiction is empowered to govern its jurisdiction, and so that there isn't a centralized body that is having to do a top-down slam on all of the different covenantal institutions that are within a particular people or culture or nation. That's my dream, but I honestly don't see how we get there without perhaps first a Christian Prince top-down approach coming to pass, something like what happened in Spain with Franco in the 1930s. Anyway, thank you for listening to my meanderings, and God bless and Godspeed.
Oh, brothers, can you hear my voice, or am I all alone? If there's no fire to guide my way, then I will start my own.
Thank you for joining us today. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, like, and share.
We'll get there yet.